for coming along again this evening. We're going to look at a whole series of things that have unraveled this past week because of the meeting of global leaders in France. There's a very interesting intersection between complete out-of-touchness on the part of leaders, global leaders, inability to talk to each other, let alone understand what the wider world is doing and experiencing, and on the other hand, a new kind of global citizens movement that's getting going. And the real question that we have for ourselves here is whether the leaders can, as it were, catch up to the citizens. Can the world's leaders catch up to the global citizens and the children, both of whom have more insight now than the global leaders? The so-called leaders, the people who happen to be in positions of leadership, are in fact not giving very much leadership and show no indication that they really understand the dimensions of the problems that the global citizens and the children are facing. The meetings themselves had their usual photo ops. As I say, the so-called leaders stood as if they were one group for all of a few seconds, while the photographer was able to take the requisite group photo. But it was hardly a meeting of much in terms of a meeting of minds or policies or intentions. In fact, it was a bit of a scramble.
The G7 summit has entered its last day in Biarritz, France, as member countries have agreed to an immediate $20 million fund to help fight raging wildfires in the Amazon. They also said they were launching a global initiative to protect the Amazon rainforest. President Trump was absent as G7 leaders met for a climate change session today, but French President Emmanuel Macron said the U.S. supported the measure. Trade was also high on the agenda at the G7 as the U.S. sent confused signals about its ongoing tariff war with China. Today, Trump told reporters, quote, China called and they want to make a deal. However, questions are being raised about the supposed call, and Trump officials have refused to give further details. This comes after Trump appeared to express doubts about his decision to raise tariffs against China, telling reporters Sunday, quote, I have second thoughts about everything. Hours after Trump made the comments, the White House claimed Trump's statements were misinterpreted and that he actually meant he wanted to ramp up tariffs even further. On Friday, the president unleashed a series of tweets saying he would raise existing tariffs on $250 billion worth of Chinese goods to 30%, and he would tax an additional $300 billion worth of Chinese imports at 15% rather than the planned 10%. This followed China's announcement it would retaliate against upcoming U.S. tariffs by raising taxes on American products. Trump also demanded Friday U.S. companies stop doing business with China. Meanwhile, Trump touted a trade deal with Japan as he met with Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. The deal includes an agreement for Japan to buy large amounts of corn from U.S. farmers. The two countries said they hope to sign the deal next month, but Japanese Prime Minister Abe said more work remains before it can be finalized. At the G7 summit, Trump also expressed his desire to bring Russia back to the Group of Seven, formerly the Group of Eight, after it was kicked out for annexing Crimea in 2014. European officials, including European Council President Donald Tusk, rejected the idea, saying next year, quote, it would be better to invite Ukraine. Trump also said his Miami resort would be an excellent location for the next G7 summit. One of the biggest surprises of the weekend came when Iran's top diplomat, Foreign Minister Javad Zarif, arrived at the summit amidst mounting tensions between the U.S. and Iran. Zarif tweeted a photo of himself in a meeting with the French President Emmanuel Macron and wrote, quote, Iran's active diplomacy in pursuit of constructive engagement continues, met Emmanuel Macron on sidelines of G7 Biarritz after extensive talks with with J.Y. Le Drian and Finance Minister, followed by a joint briefing for UK-Germany. Road ahead is difficult, but worth trying, unquote. Trump today claimed Macron asked for his approval before inviting Zarif, but reports say Trump was blindsided by his presence at the summit.
Yes, he was blindsided not only by his presence, but by virtually every subject that was brought up, especially the fires in Brazil, where Europe decided to vote $20 million to help the Brazilian government fight those fires. Well, such is the disarray among government so-called leaders. They say one thing and come out with an opposite message the next day, indicate that they'd like to negotiate, but claim that the other person in a sense initiated the call to negotiate, as China did. The claim that China did from Trump, but there's no evidence that China called Trump, no evidence that he could produce. It's really quite a staggering isolation of leadership of the Americans against a fairly irritated set of European leaders. Boris Johnson was a little bit on the sidelines as well, being a close buddy to President Trump and not being fully accepted by the other Europeans since he's trying to exit from the European Union. Well, outside citizens responded, global citizens, citizens that are acting not in the name of any one country, but in the name of the entire global community. It's very fascinating to hear their words.
Meanwhile, protesters rallied outside the G7 summit in Biarritz and other French cities, denouncing the leaders of the world's richest countries for their role in the climate crisis and economic and gender inequality, among other things. This is Aurélie Trouvé from the group Alternatives G7.
We're not speaking to the G7, to the 7 leaders. We consider this G7 to be illegitimate. We are appealing to the population to say that there is hope, that we can and we must build alternatives to the policies of these 7 leaders who are at the service of the rich and of multinationals. Whether it be Trump, Macron, Trudeau, Merkel, or the others, they all have the same policies in service of the rich and multinationals. We're opposing them with values of solidarity, with answers to the environmental crisis and respect of human rights, and the end of relationships of domination.
Amid growing
A call for protecting the environment, resisting global corporations, and a direct identity between the so-called leaders who are doing the bidding of the multinational corporations to extract and exploit both third world populations in the global south and the dominance of patriarchy in the Western countries. It's a very, very interesting amalgam of issues here. And there was a very clear indication that Macron was disrespected in a sense. I mean, they held portraits of him upside down and accusing Macron of becoming the handmaiden to these multinational corporations bent on extraction and exploitation. The concern for the Brazilian Amazon forest was very interesting because simultaneously there were demonstrations going on in Brazil against the government of Brazil that was, in the eyes of these individuals, fostering the extraction, exploitation, and ruination of the Amazon rainforest. Take a look.
Amid growing international outrage about the massive wildfires ravaging the Amazon, the Brazilian military started fighting the blazes with military planes dropping thousands of gallons of water onto the rainforest. Brazil's far-right President Jair Bolsonaro ordered military operations in 7 states to combat the fires Sunday, facing criticism from world leaders that his government was not doing enough to combat the fires, which are rapidly destroying the world's largest rainforest and paving the way for a climate catastrophe. Thursday. The fires are also devastating large swaths of land in Bolivia, where President Evo Morales said Sunday he'd accept international aid to fight the blazes that have doubled in size since Thursday. The Amazon produces 20% of the oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere and is often referred to as the lungs of the planet. Protesters across Brazil and the world took to the streets over the weekend to protest Bolsonaro, who's worked to deregulate and open up the Amazon for agribusiness, logging and mining since he came into office in January. Thousands rallied in Sao Paulo.
Okay, people rallied within Brazil and Sao Paulo, but across Brazil and throughout the world on the same weekend with a G7 meeting, and they're in effect saying, look, the group that has been brought to power by questionable elections in Brazil back in January has aggravated, intensified the extraction process from the Amazon rainforest and encouraged the expansion of agribusiness firms and agricultural export firms who are producing soybeans largely for food, for the animal production circuits that keep beef in the American diet. Staggering. This kind of international citizen reaction to what governments are doing is starting to appear in every country.
The
Amazon is a heritage for the world's health. It's unacceptable what is happening in our country today. And today, people are out on the street for the removal of a government from a place it should not be at, destroying our country, destroying our riches, killing the first peoples of this land.
Destroying the country, destroying its riches, and destroying the first peoples of this land. This became apparent in a number of different news media, including the Public Radio International, which put out an account of the backlash internationally to the fires in the Amazon.
In the Amazon region of Brazil, the Mura indigenous people have been fighting to preserve the rainforest for a long time. Tribal leader Handek Wakana Mura says the lives of his people are deeply connected with the forest. That's why the wildfires now raging through huge parts of rainforest there are a nightmare scenario.
With each passing day, we see the destruction advance, deforestation, invasion, logging. We are sad because the forest is dying. At every moment, we feel the climate changing, and the world needs the forest. We need it, and our children need it.
The Amazon wildfires are shocking and threatening, not only for Brazil. That is a quote from a government spokesman in Germany today. Oliver Stunkel is a professor at the Getulio Vargas Foundation in Sao Paulo, Brazil. So, Oliver, that quote from Germany about Brazil is significant because both Germany and France are part of the G7 summit this weekend, and they want Brazil's wildfires on the agenda. What has been the response in Brazil to this urgent call from Germany and France?
In Brazil, I would say there's been, of course, a mixed response. I mean, the government in particular is very much aligned with a traditional way of thinking about the Amazon, very much in terms not of climate change, but actually in terms of sovereignty, protecting the forest, not from destruction, but actually from outside intervention. So there's a long-standing fear, and now this has come to the fore again. And the president of Brazil, Bolsonaro, has been very clear to reject sort of any kind of criticism and saying this is part of conspiracy. He also questions the data that actually the Brazilian government itself has produced on deforestation, which has led to the ouster of one of the scientists who has led this effort. The opposition, of course, has been very critical. Indigenous populations. And, interestingly enough, agribusiness, very worried because there is a growing consensus among economists, among politicians, that this situation may actually lead to consumer boycotts against Brazilian products. But the president so far has been very clear that he's unwilling to take more active action against climate change. Bolsonaro himself does not believe in climate change.
Are you able, though, to draw a line directly from his policies to the massive wildfires we're seeing right now?
Well, I mean, I think there's two sets of things. The first is he has actively undermined the bureaucracy that previous governments had set up to monitor deforestation, to disincentivize deforestation, to punish illegal logging. He's openly sort of questioned the rationale behind his policies. But it's just one element. I think the wildfires are a symbol of a much larger problem that at this stage, this government in Brazil is unwilling to invest in protecting the Amazon. So in that sense, the deforestation has been increasing massively over the past 8 months. And I think worse is to come. I mean, a lot of this is just beginning now. And this is a new chapter in international relations. This has never happened before, that the international community considers the environmental policy of one particular country a national security threat. And I think the government of Brazil is, for the first time, facing this international backlash.
Okay. Well, this is the crisis then. I mean, yes, these forests happen to be within Brazil, but in a sense they're a global resource, a global asset, because they're absolutely crucial for the regeneration of oxygen in the global atmosphere. They capture carbon when they're functioning. By growing, they fix carbon into the biological tree trunks, branches, leaves, and the like, and the litter on the floor of the tropical rainforest can then be sequestered into the soils. But if you're releasing all of that, you're doing two things. You're not only adding to the atmospheric carbon, but you're taking away the carbon pumps, which is what the trees are. They're carbon pumps that take carbon out of the atmosphere, which we desperately need on a global basis. So, as the commentator said here, we're facing an international circumstance which we've never seen before, in effect. First time ever that the environmental policies of one country are being regarded as a national security issue on the part of other countries. The Europeans in particular, the German and the French, are trying to put in place sort of measures to stop these excessive exploitation fires in the area, to clear the land for agribusiness firms to produce food for cattle to be sold to North America. Not legit, they say.
At this stage, I don't expect Brazil's climate policy to change in the near or medium term.
Meanwhile, Oliver, the fires continue to burn and the skies are just filled with smoke. What plans does the Brazilian government have right now to fight and contain these fires?
The government has set up a crisis committee, but that's more in reaction to sort of the international outcry. The government will, of course, seek to reduce the impact that's visible to the entire population. Last week in Sao Paulo, we had dark skies. It felt like it was nighttime at about 2 p.m. suddenly, because there was clouds and mixed with ashes from the forest burning. And this was a very powerful moment when a lot of people just looked up and said, why is it dark? This brought this home to many people. And even though local governments can, to some extent, address the situation, I'm quite pessimistic that without the help of federal government, Brazil can make much progress on this front.
Well, this is very discouraging. It was so bad as a circumstance that the smoke actually got to Rio de Janeiro and made it look like a dark eclipse of the sun in the middle of the day. People began to realize this is a national issue, and they got out in the street and objected to what was being done. There is a backlash. In fact, the coverage on it was pretty...
This is Democracy Now! I'm Mina Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We turn now to Brazil, where new government data shows that deforestation in the Amazon has dramatically increased since the far-right former military officer Jair Bolsonaro became president in January. Brazil has lost more than 1,300 square miles of forest cover this year, and the pace of deforestation is increasing. One report claims that the equivalent of 3 soccer fields are being deforested every minute in the Amazon. In June, deforestation increased by 88% over the same month last year. The drastic spike is due to Bolsonaro's rolling back of regulations and allowing illegal land invasions, logging, and burning. In May, a group of former Brazilian environment ministers warned, quote, we're facing the risk of runaway deforestation in the Amazon. One former minister said that Brazil was becoming an exterminator of the future.
an exterminator of the future. Well, this is quite a dramatic language. A former Brazilian environment minister calling this government an exterminator of the future. Now, it's not for nothing, I guess, that Bolsonaro is known as the Trump of the tropics. He's giving a green light for the exploitation of this land. And in fact, he's even said he's rejected the offer of the $22 million aid package the Europeans were willing to give in order to slow down the fires.
Brazil says it's going to reject money offered by the group of 7 nations to help fight fires in the Amazon. NPR's Philip Reeves says the G7 is offering $20 million, but President Jair Bolsonaro doesn't want it.
Bolsonaro is suspicious of foreign involvement in the Amazon, seeing it as a violation of sovereignty, and $20 million is a tiny sum considering the scale of the fires. What's really upset him, though, is the European politician who organised the money, French President Emmanuel Macron. Macron wants more international controls over the forest. The two presidents have been trading insults for several days. Brazil's foreign ministers joined the fray by alleging that efforts are underway to create a fabricated crisis in the Amazon as a pretext for imposing external controls. And Bolsonaro's chief of staff suggested that G7 money should be spent on reforesting Europe. This squabble is angering Bolsonaro's critics. They say he should fight the fires, not the French. Philip Reeves, NPR News, Rio de Janeiro.
President Bolsonaro has now told reporters he will relent and accept the money if French President Macron apologizes for calling him a liar.
Well, you can see how this has basically caused a huge international row. This whole notion of who's got to apologize to whom for trying to protect the global environment. So in addition to the street demonstrations outside the G7 and on the street throughout Brazil and around the world because of Brazil's deforestation practices, there's also been a powerful global citizens movement emerging from children. Greta Thunberg started this in Sweden, and it's now taken on within a year a global perspective, including here in Massachusetts. School striking from the attendance of school until governments take climate change seriously. In the States, there are a group called Sunrise has started up, and you can sign up for it. We're building an army of young people, it says, to stop climate change and create millions of good jobs in the process. Within a year, this Swedish woman has made an impact mobilizing people around the world. She showed up in Italy, for example, and gave a blistering speech.
Ciao Roma! You should be very proud of yourselves. Our future was sold so that a small number of people could make unimaginable amounts of money. It was stolen from us every time the adults said that the sky was the limit and that you only live once. They lied to us. They gave us false hope. They told us that the future was something to look forward to. And yes, some of us can have whatever we want for now. Many of us can buy much more than we will ever need. But the only thing we really need is a future.
The only thing we really need is a future, and they feel betrayed. Children are taking the leadership. She's going to be coming to the United States to speak at the Heads of State meeting in September, convened by the Secretary General of the United Nations. She's coming over on a zero-emissions boat, a sailboat, across the Atlantic through the hurricane season. She's met with people from around the world and inviting them to join the climate strike. And it's taking on a proportion that you'll see next month, for the 20th to the 27th of September. The climate strike is going to hit nationally. If human civilization is going to survive, our leaders must learn to follow the global citizens. As the tropical storms build up, our president is talking about using nukes to stop hurricanes. What a silly idea. We have to, in effect, learn how to follow the new kind of citizens that are emerging around the world. A citizen science alliance that is working together to devise a just transition to a sustainable future.